From the quiet of my sickbed, I heard my daughter and my stepson in the next room. Their voices hushed as they picked over the bones of my life before I was even dead, deciding which of my assets to sell first. Hi, everyone. It's so good to be here with you, in this little circle of trust. I'm Grandma Adeline. My name is Adeline Sinclair. I am 80 years old, and I'm from a quiet little town in Vermont, the kind of place where you know your neighbors by the sound of their screen doors closing. This is a story about the last great secret of my life. It's a story even my own doctor doesn't fully understand. He calls my recovery a miracle. But it wasn't a miracle. It was a choice. A choice I made the moment I realized the two people I had dedicated my life to raising were not waiting for me to get better. They were waiting for me to die. To tell this story, it feels like admitting the most profound failure a mother can face. It's one thing to be betrayed by a stranger. It's another to learn that to your own children, your only remaining value is the price tag on your belongings. Before I open that door, it would give this old heart so much strength if you would please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support reminds me that a story, especially a difficult one, is a thing of value. And today, I need to be reminded of what true value really is. My story doesn't begin in a hospital bed. It begins in a dusty, wonderful, magical place. It begins in a bookstore with the man I loved, my husband, Arthur Dunn. Oh, my Arthur. He was not a man of numbers or of business, not really. He was a man of stories. He was an English professor who believed that a book was not just paper and ink, but a doorway into 1,000 different lives. His love was a quiet, literary thing. It was in the way he would leave a poem on my pillow, in the way he would read to me by the fire, his voice a low, comforting rumble. Together, we built a life that was our own favorite story. We took our life savings and bought a small, struggling bookstore in our town. We called it the Sinclair Press. It was more than a business. It was a sanctuary, a place where people could come to get lost in the pages of a book. Arthur and I, we worked side by side for 40 years, building it into a beloved local institution. It was our third child, the product of our shared love for the written word. Our first two children were my stepson, David, and our daughter, Caroline. I came into David's life when he was just a boy of 10. His own mother, Arthur's first wife, had been taken by a sickness years before, and he was a quiet, wounded little soul. I never tried to replace his mother. I only tried to be mother. I poured my heart into that boy. I helped him with his homework. I cheered the loudest at his football games. I taught him how to dance for his first prom. I loved him as my own. And for many years, I thought he loved me too. But there was always a little part of him I couldn't quite reach, a quiet, resentful core that always remembered I was the stepmother, the replacement. He grew up to be a man who was good, but with a streak of his father's practicality that without Arthur's warmth, sometimes curdled into a cold, hard ambition. Then came Caroline, our daughter. She was the light of our lives, a bright, bubbly girl who grew up amongst the bookshelves. She was a child of stories, just like us. But as she got older, she seemed to inherit all of the ambition and none of the sentiment. She was brilliant, sharp, and deeply practical. She saw our beloved bookstore not as a sanctuary, but as an underperforming asset. "Mom," she'd say, "even as a teenager, you and Dad have to modernize. You have to think about the brand, the bottom line." She loved us, I knew, but she loved us in the way one loves a pair of charming, hopelessly outdated, and financially naive old relatives. When Arthur passed away 5 years ago, the heart of our family's story was ripped out, and I was left alone, the sole caretaker of his legacy, the bookstore, the beautiful old house we had lived in for 50 years, and our two very different children. The shift in my children, the slow creeping realignment of their priorities, began almost immediately after the funeral. David, my stepson, who was now married to a sharp, equally ambitious woman named Megan, began to take a new, proprietary interest in the bookstore. He wasn't interested in the books. He was interested in the books. The accounting books. He saw it as his birthright, his father's legacy, and I was just the elderly caretaker, keeping the seat warm for him. Caroline, my daughter, became obsessed with the house. She and her husband, a man who worked in finance, would walk through the rooms, their eyes scanning the antique furniture, the paintings, my late husband's first editions. They weren't seeing memories. They were seeing an auction catalog. They became a team, my daughter and my stepson. A quiet, efficient, and deeply practical alliance. Their love for me became dutiful. They would call. They would visit. But the conversations were always laced with a subtle, pressing concern for my affairs. Mom, have you updated your will recently? Dad's collection of antique maps. They really should be properly appraised and insured. This house is so big for you, Mother. The upkeep must be a terrible burden. Nay. They were no longer my children. They were my future executors. They were vultures, circling, but with the most loving, concerned expressions on their faces. The beginning of the end came 6 months ago. It started with a dizzy spell, then a shortness of breath. The doctors were grim. It was my heart. A severe, congestive heart failure that had apparently been quietly getting worse for years. The prognosis was not good. They told me to get my affairs in order. They told me to prepare my family. And my children, oh, they were perfect. They sprang into action. They were pillars of concerned, loving support. Caroline took over managing my bills. David started helping out at the bookstore, taking the day-to-day operations off my tired shoulders. They were the very picture of devoted, dutiful children. They insisted I have round-the-clock care in my own home. They hired a nurse, a quiet, gentle woman from the Philippines named Maria Deal. Maria was a breath of fresh, clean air in the suffocating atmosphere of my children's concern. She was not a vulture. She was a guardian. She didn't see me as a patient, a problem, or a collection of assets. She saw me as a person. She would read to me for hours from my husband's favorite books. She would listen, her eyes full of a genuine, unforced sympathy, as I told her stories of my life, of Arthur, of the children they used to be. She was not just my nurse. She was my friend. She was the only person in that house who was not waiting for me to die. And my children? They saw her as the help, a necessary, but ultimately invisible, part of the machinery of my decline. I was confined to my bed, weak, and often drifting in and out of a drowsy, medicated haze. My children believed I was mostly unaware, a fading ghost in my own home. They would have their quiet, practical conversations in the hallway, just outside my bedroom door, their voices low and hushed, believing I was too sick, too sedated to hear. But I heard. Oh my goodness, I heard everything. And what I heard was the sound of my own heart breaking, far more completely than any medical condition ever could. My bedroom, the room I had shared with Arthur for 50 years, became a cage. But it was also a listening post. From the quiet stillness of my bed, I became a spy in my own life, an unwilling eavesdropper on the slow, methodical dismantling of my own legacy. At first, their hushed conversations in the hallway were disguised as responsible planning. It was the sound of dutiful children getting their frail mother's affairs in order. The property taxes are due next month, I'd hear Caroline say, her voice a crisp, efficient whisper. I'll pay it from her main account for now, but we need to start thinking about liquidating some of the smaller assets to ensure there's enough cash flow for the continued care. Continued care. It was their euphemism for the long, slow, expensive business of my dying. David would reply, his voice a low, practical rumble. What about the first editions in the library? Dad's collection of Dickens. That's got to be worth a fortune. We should get an appraiser in here. Quietly, of course. We don't want to upset her. They were talking about selling my husband's heart, his most treasured possessions, and their primary concern was not my feelings, but the logistics of doing it without me noticing. The arrogance of it, the cold, transactional nature of their grief, was a constant, dull ache in my chest. Maria, my nurse, was my only solace. She would come into my room after they had left, her face a mask of quiet, sorrowful anger. She heard it too. She would just take my hand, her touch a small, warm anchor in the cold sea of my children's pragmatism. She never said a word against them, but in her eyes I saw a shared, unspoken truth. She saw them for what they were. Little by little, their conversations became less about managing my affairs and more about managing their inheritance. They were no longer just planning for my death. They were spending my money before I was even gone. One afternoon, I was drifting in that hazy space between sleep and wakefulness when I heard their voices, sharp and urgent, from the hallway. "Megan is right, David," Caroline said, her voice a low hiss. "We can't wait. The market for vintage jewelry is at an all-time high. Mother's pearls, the ones from Grandma. They could pay for the kids' college tuition. Both of them. It's foolish to just let them sit in a safe deposit box." "Nay, uns." My mother's pearls. The ones she had worn on her wedding day. The ones she had placed around my neck on mine. Caroline was talking about them as if they were a stock certificate, a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. She wasn't just planning to sell an object. She was planning to sell a memory. "We can't just take them, Caroline," David argued, but his voice was weak, his protest a whisper against the hurricane of his sister's ambition. "She's still alive. It's stealing." "It's not stealing, it's preemptive estate planning," she shot back, her voice dripping with a chilling corporate logic. "It's what she would want, for the money to be used for her grandchildren. We'll tell her they were misplaced. In her condition, she'll believe it. She'll forget she ever had them." The cruelty of it, the cold, calculated gaslighting of a sick old woman, was a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs. They were going to steal from me, and then use my illness as a way to convince me I had lost my own mind. My own children. My daughter, the girl I had rocked to sleep. My stepson, the boy I had loved as my own. They were vultures of the worst kind, picking over the carcass of my life with a smile, telling themselves it was for the good of the flock. A new emotion began to bubble up through the thick, muddy layers of my grief and my sickness. It was a cold, quiet, and profoundly powerful rage. It was the anger of a woman who had been declared dead while her heart was still beating. I didn't let on that I had heard. I continued to play the part they had cast me in. I was the frail, fading matriarch. I would smile weakly when they'd come into my room. I would pretend to be confused. I would let them manage my life. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the house was still, a new energy began to flow through me. It was the energy of a singular, driving purpose. I had to get better. Not for them, but for me. I had to live. I had to live long enough to correct this terrible, heartbreaking injustice. My recovery became my secret, subversive project. When Maria would come in with my pills, I would ask her, in a low whisper, what each one was for. The powerful sedatives, the ones that kept me in a fog. I would pretend to swallow them and then spit them out into a tissue when she wasn't looking. The heart medication, the ones that would actually help me heal. I took them with a religious devotion. I started doing the physical therapy exercises she taught me, not just when she was watching, but in the middle of the night, my muscles screaming in protest. I would push myself up in bed, my arms shaking, until I could sit on my own. I would stand holding onto the bedpost for a few seconds longer each day. My weakness, the very thing my children were counting on, was becoming my greatest disguise. They saw a dying woman. They had no idea I was a warrior in training. Maria was my silent, knowing accomplice. She saw what I was doing. She saw the new light in my eyes, the new strength in my grip. She never said a word, but she started bringing me extra protein in my soup. She started leaving the heavy curtains in my room open a little wider to let in the healing sunlight. We were a team of two, staging a quiet rebellion in a sick room. The final, devastating conversation, the one that sealed their fate and cemented my resolve, came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. They thought I was asleep. They were in the library, my Arthur's sacred space, going through his things. Their voices were low, but in the quiet, rain-soaked house, I heard every single word. They were talking about the bookstore. My bookstore. Our bookstore. The offer is solid, Caroline, David said. A commercial developer. They want the whole block. They'll pay a fortune for the building, but they want it empty. We have to liquidate the inventory. Liquidate the inventory. Sell off 40 years of carefully curated books, a lifetime of my husband's passion, by the pound. What about the staff? Caroline asked. Not with concern, but with a cold practicality. Mrs. Davison has been there for 30 years. She'll make a fuss. We'll give them a severance package, David said dismissively. A small one. We can't afford to be sentimental. We have to be smart about this. As soon as we have the power to sign the papers, we sell. We don't wait. We take the money and we get out. We take the money and we get out. As soon as we have the power to sign the papers. They were just waiting for my signature to fade from the world, for my hand to grow cold, so they could sign their own names and sell my husband's soul to a developer. And then, Caroline said the words that lit the final fuse. It's for the best, she said, her voice full of a smug, self-righteous certainty. She's a burden, David. A sweet one, but a burden nonetheless. This is our turn now. It's our inheritance. It's what she and Dad would have wanted, for us to be secure, for us to be free. A burden. I was a burden on their inheritance. My life was an obstacle to their freedom. I lay in my bed, the rain streaming down the window pane like tears, and I did not feel sadness. I did not feel grief. I felt a profound, cleansing, and utterly liberating rage. The sick woman, the grieving widow, the fading mother. She died in that moment, and the woman who was left was Adeline Sinclair, the co-founder of the Sinclair Press, a woman who had built a life and a business with her own 2 hands, and who was not about to let 2 greedy, ungrateful children tear it all down. My recovery was no longer a secret project. It was a weapon, and I was about to sharpen it to a razor's edge. They thought they were waiting for me to die. They had no idea. I was just waiting for the right moment to come back to life. My miraculous recovery began the very next morning. When my children came to visit, expecting to find their frail, fading mother drifting in her medicated haze, they found something else entirely. They found me sitting up in a chair by the window, dressed not in my nightgown, but in a crisp, clean blouse and trousers. The curtains were wide open. The room was flooded with light. I was reading a book. They stopped dead in the doorway, their faces a comical picture of stunned disbelief. "Mom?" Caroline stammered, her voice a squeak. "What? What are you doing out of bed? You're supposed to be resting." "I'm tired of resting, dear," I said, not looking up from my book. I turned a page, slowly, deliberately. "I've decided I'd rather read." David rushed to my side, his face a mask of performative concern. "But your heart, your condition, you're too weak. You need to be in bed. Maria," he called out, his voice a sharp, commanding bark. "Get in here. My mother is out of bed." Maria appeared in the doorway, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. She was the best actress of us all. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sinclair," she said, her voice full of a professional deference. She insisted. "She's been feeling much stronger this morning." I finally looked up from my book. I looked at my 2 children, at the panic and confusion warring with the greed in their eyes, and I smiled. A real, genuine, and utterly terrifying smile. It was the smile of a woman who had been listening from the next room. "I feel wonderful, children," I said, my voice clear and strong. "In fact, I think I've been over-medicated. All that rest was making me foggy. I've decided to take a more active role in my own recovery." This was not part of their plan. Their narrative, the one they had so carefully constructed, depended on my slow, steady, and predictable decline. A recovery, especially a sudden and dramatic one, was a logistical nightmare. It would delay the sale of the bookstore. It would postpone the appraisal of my jewelry. It would force them to continue playing the part of devoted, caring children, a role I knew they were growing weary of. For the next week, I became their sweetest, most difficult patient. I was a force of cheerful, determined life in a house they had already marked for death. I insisted on coming downstairs for meals. I would sit at the head of the dining room table, in my rightful place, and I would ask them detailed, pointed questions about the bookstore. "How are the quarterly sales looking, David?" I'd ask, my mind, now clear of the sedatives, as sharp as it had ever been. "Have you restocked the poetry section? I know it's not a big seller, but it's the soul of the shop." "Entwang." He would stammer and deflect, caught completely off guard. He hadn't been managing the store. He had been preparing it for liquidation. I would ask Caroline about my finances, my investments. "Dear, I was feeling so much better today. I thought I might call Mr. Henderson, our financial advisor. I think it's time I started managing my own portfolio again." The look of sheer, blind panic on her face was a thing of beauty. They were losing control. The dying patient had gotten out of bed, walked to the control room, and was now sitting firmly at the master console. Maria was my co-conspirator. She would help me walk the hallways, rebuilding my strength, while my children were out of the house. She would read the fine print on my medication bottles to me, helping me understand what was a sedative and what was a vital medicine. We were a silent, two-woman army, planning our quiet coup. The final act, my grand checkmate, was planned with the meticulous detail of a novelist plotting her final chapter. I knew I couldn't just get better. I had to create a public, undeniable spectacle of my recovery. I had to seize the narrative back from them, in a way they could never dispute. And I knew the perfect stage, my own 80th birthday party. A party they had, of course, already started planning. A quiet, somber affair, they had told their friends, to be held at my house. A chance to say goodbye to the beloved family matriarch. They had no idea it was going to be a coming-out party. I made my move the week before the event. I called my lawyer. I called my financial advisor. I called the manager of my bookstore, the loyal Mrs. Davison. I had a series of long, very specific conversations. New documents were drawn up. New plans were put in place. The day of the party, I allowed them to help me get ready. I let them fuss over me, dressing me in a soft, lavender dress, the color of a twilight sky. I let them help me down the stairs, leaning on David's arm, playing the part of the frail, beloved, and dying grandmother to perfection. The house was filled with all of our oldest friends, colleagues from the university, loyal customers from the bookstore. Their faces were all a mask of gentle, pitying sadness. They were all there to pay their last respects. My children, the dutiful, grieving hosts, moved among them, accepting condolences for a death that had not yet occurred. The moment came after the cake had been served. My son David tapped a glass for silence. He stood up to make a toast. His speech was a masterpiece of loving, heartfelt hypocrisy. He spoke of my life, my love for his father, my devotion to my family. He spoke of my brave, quiet battle with my illness. He painted me as a gentle, fading saint. "And so," he concluded, his voice thick with a perfectly feigned emotion, "we raise a glass to my mother, Adeline, a woman who built a legacy of love and literature, a legacy that we, her children, will be so proud to carry on in her name." He was giving my eulogy at my birthday party. The arrogance of it was breathtaking. The room was filled with the sound of soft, sympathetic weeping. Everyone drank. They were toasting my memory. And then I stood up. My legs were steady. My voice, when I spoke, was not the weak, reedy whisper they had grown used to. It was clear and strong, and it filled the silent, expectant room. "Thank you, David," I said, my voice ringing with a strength that made him visibly flinch. That was a beautiful speech, a little premature perhaps, but beautiful nonetheless. A gasp rippled through the crowd. This was not the voice of a dying woman. "You are all so kind to be here," I continued, my gaze sweeping across the faces of my friends. "To celebrate my life. But I have a small confession to make. The rumors of my imminent departure have been greatly exaggerated." I took a step away from my chair. I stood, unsupported, in the center of the room. As it turns out, I am feeling much, much better. In fact, I have decided that I am not yet ready to retire from the business of living. And to that end, I have a few announcements to make about the future. I saw the look of pure animal terror on my children's faces. This was their worst nightmare, come to life. My fight back was not an accusation. It was a series of joyous, life-affirming business announcements. First, I said, my voice bright and full of a newfound energy, I have decided to take back the reins at the Sinclair Press. Starting tomorrow, we will be undergoing a major renovation and expansion. We will be adding a coffee shop, a children's reading room, and a series of author events. Mrs. Davison, I said, looking at my loyal manager, who was now weeping with joy, will be promoted to general manager with a significant raise. And I will be there every single day as the active and very much a leave owner. A wave of shocked, delighted applause filled the room. David and Caroline just stared at me, their faces white as sheets. I had just dismantled their plan to sell the bookstore with a single happy announcement. Second, I continued, my voice gaining strength, I have decided this old house is, in fact, too big for me, so I will be selling it. I saw a flicker of monstrous, desperate hope in my children's eyes. Maybe they would get the money after all. I will be selling the house, I repeated, to a wonderful local historical society for a nominal fee. They have agreed to preserve it, in my husband's name, as a museum and a public library, so that it can continue to be a sanctuary of stories for this community for generations to come. The hope in their eyes died, replaced by a look of utter, profound devastation. I had just given away their inheritance. And as for me, I said, delivering the final, most personal, and most satisfying blow of all, I will be moving, but not to a nursing home. I have decided to take all of my remaining assets, the ones my children were so worried about, and I am going to use them to live. I am going to travel. I am going to travel. I am going to see the world I have only ever read about in books. I paused. I looked at my two children, my two failed executors, who were now standing in the ruins of their own greed. But I won't be traveling alone, I said. I turned and smiled at the one person in that room who had shown me true, selfless kindness. Maria, I said, my voice now soft and full of a deep, genuine affection. I have a business proposition for you. I would like to hire you, not as my nurse, but as my paid traveling companion. The salary will be significant, and your first duty will be to help me decide where we should go first. Paris or Rome? Maria just stared at me, her hand flying to her mouth, tears of pure, uncomprehending joy streaming down her face. And that was my checkmate. I had not accused my children. I had not exposed their greed. I had simply, with a series of happy, life-affirming choices, written them out of my story. I had taken the assets they were so eager to claim, and I had transformed them, not into cash for their pockets, but into a legacy of my own making, a thriving bookstore, a public museum, and a life of adventure for myself and the one person who had proven she was worthy of my trust. I hadn't just recovered. I had been reborn, and my new life was just beginning. The party did not end. It transformed. The somber, funereal atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a current of buzzing, joyful, and slightly scandalized energy. My friends, who had come to say goodbye, now crowded around me, their faces alight with a mixture of shock, delight, and profound respect. They weren't mourning a dying woman. They were celebrating a declaration of independence. My children, David and Caroline, were left in the wake of my announcements like two statues in a hurricane. They were surrounded by the debris of their own failed coup. Their friends and colleagues who had been offering them hushed condolences just moments before were now looking at them with a new, speculative curiosity. The narrative had shifted, and they were no longer the grieving, dutiful children. They were the greedy, disinherited ones. They made their exit quickly and quietly, without so much as a goodbye. They just vanished. Two ghosts at a party that had suddenly and gloriously come to life. The aftermath of that night was a quiet, methodical, and deeply satisfying process of reclamation. True to my word, the very next Monday, the renovations at the Sinclair Press began. I was there every single day, a hard hat perched on my white hair, directing the contractors, choosing the paint colors, and overseeing the design of the new children's wing. The work was invigorating. It filled my days with purpose. I wasn't just renovating a bookstore. I was rebuilding my own life, board by board. The sale of the house to the Historical Society went through without a hitch. My children's lawyers sent a few angry, blustering letters, questioning my competence and undue influence, but they had no legal ground to stand on. I was of sound mind and body, a fact my own doctor, stunned by my miraculous recovery, was happy to attest to. The day I handed the keys to the Historical Society was not sad. It was a triumph. I knew that my home, my Arthur's legacy, was now safe forever. It would be cared for, cherished, and filled with the stories it was meant to hold. I was not losing a house. I was gaining a museum in my husband's name. And my children, their lives, which had been so confidently mapped out around a future inheritance, were thrown into chaos. David, my stepson, had to face the reality that the bookstore he had been planning to sell was now a thriving, expanding business under the firm control of the woman he had tried to sideline. His position in the family, as the de facto heir, was gone. He was just a man who had been publicly and gracefully put back in his place. Caroline, my daughter, was perhaps hit the hardest. Her entire financial future, which she had so carefully built on the foundation of my assets, had vanished. She and her husband had to sell their own oversized house. They had to learn to live within their own means, a concept I don't think they had ever truly considered. They have not spoken to me since that day. The silence is a heavy, painful thing. A mother should not be estranged from her children. But I have learned, in my 80 years, that some relationships are a house that is no longer safe to live in. Sometimes, the only thing you can do is walk away before the whole thing collapses on top of you. And Maria? Oh, my dear Maria. She is my joy. She is the daughter of my heart. We did go to Paris and to Rome. We have spent the last 2 years seeing the world together. We have eaten pasta in Tuscany. We have seen the pyramids in Egypt. We have walked on the Great Wall of China. She is not my nurse. She is my friend, my companion, my family. She sends postcards to her own children from every corner of the globe, and I have established a trust that will ensure they have the education and the opportunities she never did. She cared for me when I was at my lowest, and it is the greatest privilege of my life to now be able to care for her future. The lesson I learned, the one that was forged in the fire of my children's betrayal, is a simple one. It is that life is not a dress rehearsal. You do not get to wait in the wings for your own story to begin. I had spent so many years defining myself as a wife and a mother that I had forgotten to be the main character in my own life. My children's greed, in a strange and terrible way, was a gift. It was a wake-up call. It was a brutal, painful, and ultimately life-saving reminder that my story was not over. Do not ever let anyone write your final chapter for you. Do not let them give you your eulogy while you are still breathing. Your life, your assets, your legacy, they are not a burden for you to carry, but a toolbox for you to use. You get to decide what to build. Even at 80, especially at 80, you have the right to start a renovation, to knock down the old walls of expectation and build something new, something beautiful, something that is entirely and gloriously your own. Thank you for letting me share my story of this unexpected recovery. It feels good to finally be the author of my own tale. If my story has inspired you to pick up your own pen, I would be so honored if you would like this video and subscribe to our channel. And please, be sure to ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter together. The comments below are our own little bookstore, a place filled with 1,000 different stories, so please, if you feel so moved, share a story about a time you started a new chapter in your own life. Love you all. This is Grandma Adeline, and I'll see you in the next story.